let's not forget that Emily Altman is the woman who said that Bob Durst admitted to being in Los Angeles, staying at the Beverly Hilton the day Susan Berman was killed. Now, she backtracked that testimony after apparently speaking to her husband, Stuart, who we're going to hear from, who is a longtime acquaintance of Robert Durst, went to high school with him, and actually is an attorney who represented him. So, this is key testimony because it puts Durst at the scene, or at least the correct city, when Susan Berman was killed, and now she's changing her testimony ostensibly to protect him, either at Durst's request or her husband's request. He's going to testify via videotape, I'm sure, very soon.
But Neama, the problem with this case that we've seen over and over again with all of these witnesses is their recollection. I mean, we're talking about details dating back to the early 1980s when Susan Berman first disappeared and was found dead. I should say when Kathy Durst first disappeared, and then Susan Berman later found murdered. So it seems like Emily Altman is having trouble recollecting, but also at the same time, she appears to be laughing and smiling in answering the questions. What do you think the jury makes of this witness?
Derek, it's challenging. It's a combination of two factors. You have murders that are decades old. In the case of Kathy Durst, almost 40 years old. And even Susan Berman, the charges in this case, is more than 20 years old.
Right.
And you have witnesses, many of which are elderly. So, between the time that has passed and the age of these witnesses, the prosecution is doing the best job it can. I mean, it did lock in some of this testimony back in 2017. That's when we're seeing these recordings being played. But still, very challenging for the prosecution. These are not fresh murders by any stretch.
But is it safe to say, though, that Emily Altman is biased here, being a friend of Robert Durst, and this talk of permission to talk to investigators?
Derek, I agree she's biased. And, again, we'll see. We have the preview when her husband testifies. Stuart, he admits to being biased. He admits to being a friend of Bob Durst. And he says, look, I'm his attorney. I've represented him. So I am biased. So I think that's something that jurors are going to pick up on. Obviously, the close relationship between Emily and Stuart, the Altmans, and Bob Durst. I mean, there's no question that bias is there. But at least as far as John Lewin is concerned, he does want to place Durst at the scene the day of the murder, because there is some question whether he was in Los Angeles or in another city the day she was killed.
To be trying to establish Susan Berman, or I should say Kathy Durst here, the first wife of Robert Durst, setting the stage for what her life was like, her dating life, whether she had a cocaine problem. Emily Altman on the stand said, yes, she certainly does. So let's bring in Neama Rahmani again. So Neama, setting the stage for how Kathy Durst was as a person, how is that important here?
Derek, I mean, you nailed it, setting the stage. And this is years ago, and the defense is already setting the stage in the defense and their themes in this case. And we saw it during both opening statements, the one before the pandemic and the one that resumed back in when we started court just a month ago, that Kathy Durst had a drug problem, that she is unstable. So we're hearing a lot of testimony about cocaine, other drug use, dating back to Kathy's time at college here in UCLA. So the defense is getting out these points through key witnesses, and it's going to go to their theory of the case, that Kathy just disappeared either because she just wanted to leave Bob Durst or because of some cocaine or other drug problem.
So are they trying to say it's possible that she, disappeared under circumstances other than being connected to Robert Durst here? I mean, how do they connect those dots? How do they make that leap?
Derek, Kathy Durst was apparently gone girl before the book and the movie came out. I mean, that's what they're trying to argue, that she just took off. I mean, this is someone that stopped showing up at her medical school internships and rotations, and she was just done with whatever life that she was living at the time, and she just disappeared off the face of the earth, or she ended up in a ditch somewhere because she had a drug problem, because ultimately her body was never found, and they're just trying to create reasonable doubt here and just point to any theory that's plausible aside from Bob Durst.
And so the bottom line is this witness a good witness in terms of what happened to Kathy Durst? I mean, she's obviously, as we said before, biased in favor of Robert. So are jurors seeing her as a good witness?
I think she's a good witness for the defense with respect to Kathy Durst, but I like her testimony for the state with respect to Susan Berman's disappearance, because again, she can put Bob in Los Angeles, just a few miles away from where she was killed. So it cuts both ways. I know the state's theory has everything to do with Kathy Durst, but they also need some better evidence. Physical evidence, corroborating evidence, eyewitness testimony, those types of things that tie Bob Durst to the death of his best friend, Susan Berman.
Talking about dinner plans he had with Susan Berman and Robert Durst. This testimony important because it sets up a timeline of sorts. Let's bring in former federal prosecutor Neama Rahmani here. Neama, the timing and this witness seems to very much remember all of the details around this dinner that he was supposed to have with Susan Berman and Robert Durst. Talk about the timing he testified to.
Derek, timing is critical here, right? So Susan Berman is killed right around the holidays, and you have Alfred saying specifically that Susan told him that Bobby was coming during the holidays, because we know what the defense is going to argue here, that Bob Durst was in San Francisco. There's a flight that left San Francisco the day after Susan Berman's body was found. So where Bob Durst was during those critical days during the holidays back in 2000 is going to be key in this case. And you have Alfred saying that no, Bob Durst was actually in Los Angeles at the time Susan Berman was killed. So these days are absolutely important for the prosecution.
And you know, Neama, what strikes me about this witness is how clear his memory seems to be, right? We've had other witnesses seem a little foggy, not being able to remember, saying directly, I don't recall. This witness, very clear about the details around this conversation about the dinner plan, right?
No question. He was unequivocal, both during direct and cross-examination. He was absolutely sure about the dates, what Susan Berman told him, the date that he was supposed to have dinner with Bob Durst. So I think he was a very good witness for the prosecution. And coupled with Altman, I think that the state did a good job of laying the foundation for Bob Durst being in Los Angeles at that Beverly Hilton hotel the day Susan Berman was killed.
Yeah, but Neama, as you know, the accuracy of this timeline is sort of being called into question as well, right? I mean, on the other side of the coin, the timing seems to be a bone of contention. There is he sipped on a bottle of water, wearing 2 hearing aids, his head shaved, a medical mask, at least from the back, not looking very well. But on Alfred Cleffin, you know, forget what I said earlier about him not being able to remember, because he goes on the stand and says directly right there, I have short-term memory issues, I don't recall. So it seems like he impeached himself there, Neama.
But let's just kind of go through the timeline, right? Susan Berman's body is found on Christmas Eve. So that's December 24th. You know, there's a flight from San Francisco that apparently Bob Durst was on the day before. So that's going to be December 23rd. And that's why the testimony of LAPD is so critically important about the rigor mortis and when Susan Berman was killed. But you know, as far as Alfred's impeachment, you know, he did make a statement that he couldn't definitively say that it was December, but he did stick to the fact that Bob Durst was there for the holidays. So, you know, he didn't deviate from that testimony. And again, I think it was still helpful testimony for the prosecution to help put Bob Durst in Los Angeles on that, you know, December 22nd, December 23rd, December 24th timeline. That's right around the holidays.
But is it a challenge, though, for the jurors here to really kind of dig into this timeline and not be distracted by the little finer points here that the attorneys seem to be quibbling over in terms of the timing, whether it's December or January, talking to investigators then or earlier? Is it hard for the jurors, do you think?
It's very hard. I mean, you're talking about 5 months of testimony, and let's just be 100% honest here, Derek. Susan Berman's case is the most challenging of the 3 murders. There's the least evidence. Morris Black was the most, but obviously Bob Durst was acquitted on a self-defense theory there. You know, there's more evidence related to Kathy Durst, so that's why the state has focused so much time on that case. But there really isn't a lot of evidence that directly ties Bob Durst to the murder of his best friend and longtime publicist, Susan Berman. It's really a circumstantial case. You know, there's some admissions, there's that cadaver note, obviously, and they're going to focus on the jinx. That's a big part of the case. But this is a very challenging case for the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office, no question.
and complicated by the length of time that's passed between the murder of Susan Berman and also the disappearance of Kathy Durst back in 1982. So it's pretty heartbreaking. You talk about this friend who last saw his friend before he died, before he got news that he was missing, and saying it just broke him down.
Yeah, Derek, very sad case. Unfortunately, I was unable to get the courtroom audio. I did see the video there, but just a real tragic case involving a missing son. Well, at least that's what the defense is arguing, but there's certainly plenty of evidence that implicates his father in the death. It reminds me of actually the Baby Joe case, the last trial that you and I covered on Law and Crime, where the father is arguing that, the child basically left and took off, and that's why he disappeared. But there's plenty of forensic evidence that ties the father to the murder of his child.
Right, absolutely. We'll get into that ahead with some of the testimony. Around the time that Dylan showed up at the airport and was picked up by his father, I guess pointing to the strained relationship or the body language between the two, right?
No question, Derek. This is a foundational witness, and we know the state is focused on this video because they discussed the Walmart video and the very kind of bizarre interaction between father and son in that video. So we're going to see apparently a video of when the son Dylan came to the airport and father came to pick him up, apparently. So this witness just there for foundational purposes, and hopefully we'll see that video very soon.
Right. We have to establish, I guess, the line of questioning with the witness before we actually see the video, right?
Yeah, sometimes the state and the defense will stipulate to the authenticity that this is a fair and accurate depiction of the video. Apparently that didn't happen here. Sometimes judges will pressure the attorneys to agree to the authenticity when it's not in dispute to move things along, but doesn't always happen, and that's why we need witnesses like this.
Gotcha. All right. Neama Rahmani there watching this with me closely. State of Colorado versus Mark Redwine. We should kind of remind our viewers about the circumstances of this trial. You've got a 59-year-old father accused of killing his young son, Dylan, and it's alleged because Dylan and his brother saw some pictures of the father maybe cross-dressing on camera and also committing an act that people would just find disgusting. I won't repeat it here, but there's some salacious details surrounding this case, right?
No question. These pictures are disturbing, to say the least, and the alleged motive for the crime. And what this prosecution is trying to show here is really the strained relationship, between father and son. Someone who would normally be very excited to see his son after some period of time. Apparently, right before this incident, there was a fire at the home, and there were some renovations done. So, Mark hadn't seen Dylan for quite some time. But really, at least we all got the sense that, Dylan didn't want to see his father. Father wasn't very excited to see his son. And that's part of the state's theory in this case, to really show this very strange, bizarre, strained relationship between father and son.
Right, and then when we fast forward to the actual murder, there's forensic evidence, DNA evidence, blood samples actually found in the home. Then also the body parts of the son dismembered, found in two different places. His body found, 1 year, and then the next year his skull was found, and not far from the family home, right?
Yes, you have that blood all over the living room and the carpet and the coffee table. So that's very, very powerful evidence for the state. You have the cadaver dogs that picked up scents, in the laundry room and in, Mark's vehicle. And then you have this really dismembered body. The skull obviously suffered blunt force trauma. There's evidence of knife marks, it's found years and really miles apart. So the body was dismembered. Really kind of heinous, brutal murder here. Not really consistent with someone who just kind of walked off and, a relatively older boy who was maybe attacked by animals. Again, that's going to be the defense theory in this case. Not particularly plausible given the physical evidence that we found at Mark's home. Right.
So as this case, goes forward, do you think we'll hear from the defendant, the father here? Would it be in his benefit to testify?
I generally think it's not in a criminal defendant's benefit to testify when there's strong evidence in this case, but we know, and maybe it's just been our luck as a prosecutor, former prosecutor, you love it when the defendant testifies because you can just go after him. And imagine being cross-examined on these really sort of just damaging photographs of him, cross-dressing and wearing a diaper. And I won't get into the rest of it. It's about lunchtime here in Los Angeles to keep everyone's food down. But it would be a devastating and brutal cross-examination by the prosecutors in this case. So I don't expect him to testify, but ultimately it is the client's choice. It is the criminal defendant's choice. And we've had a string recently on the Law and Crime Network where we've gotten fortunate and the criminal defendant has testified and we've seen those fireworks.
Absolutely, and we thank you for sparing us the disgusting details. Our viewers can Google it on their own. This video technician sort of porting out surveillance video showing Mark Redwine, his son Dylan, in her store, maybe their body language. There's been testimony that the two had a strained relationship. This witness really trying to establish the video that may show that. Right now, we're not getting to the most detailed part of it, but I want to bring in Neama Rahmani, former federal prosecutor here. Just talk about this case in general and the circumstances surrounding this relationship between father and son. There's been testimony that Dylan didn't want to go and travel to see his father. They lived apart. We had a previous witness at the airport talking about airport surveillance video, really showing their body language being really off here. Right, Neama?
Part of the state's theory of the case that Dylan didn't like his father, and there's obviously very sort of strange, bizarre relationship, setting aside the pictures that both sons found, both Dylan and his half-brother found on Mark's computer there. So I understand how prosecutors love video. Video doesn't lie. Doesn't seem to be anything particularly powerful yet. Obviously we still have approximately about 20 minutes or so of video coming up, but this is something that the state highlighted in their opening statement, so I expect to see something good. Clearly what we've seen so far is father and son enter Walmart and they go their separate ways. Father shopping for produce, son, being 12 years old or 13 years old, goes to the video game section. So nothing really unexpected so far, but hopefully, at least as far as the state's concerned, we see something good pretty soon, because the last thing you want to do as a prosecutor is overpromise and underdeliver. Right,
and you mentioned it's about a 30-minute video or so, a little over 30 minutes. We've seen about 10 minutes so far, so there's still a ways to go. Also, though, when we look at the details of this case, you mentioned the pictures that were on Mark Redwine's computer, where the son Dylan and his half-brother Corey also were able to see, apparently showing Mark Redwine dressed as a woman.
Absolutely. I mean, as the state, you want some sort of motive, right? Because as a juror, you're sitting back thinking, and if you're in Colorado there, what would cause a father to kill his own son? Like, what must have happened? So you got to give those jurors something to hang their hat on when they're back in that deliberation room, just because it's just really bizarre behavior, both in terms of what Mark was doing, but the fact that he would engage in such violent actions towards his own child. I mean, notwithstanding any sort of custody dispute or strange relationship. So I think, as far as the puzzle is concerned, at least the prosecutors in this case believe that this type of video and the testimony from Dylan's friends will really show that this isn't your typical father-son relationship. This is someone who, in terms of Dylan at least, did not like his father. Father did not like the son. So, when he was confronted with these images, he went berserk, and that's when the violence ensued.
We were just showing pictures a moment ago of Dylan Redwine, very photogenic, cute kid. That's obviously going to play into the minds of the jurors, right? Tugging on their heartstrings, really. A 13-year-old boy who really didn't have a chance to live much, and allegedly murdered by his own father.
Incredibly sad case, Derek. I mean, all of these cases are sad that we cover here on Law and Crime. I mean, someone's been killed. It's just one case after another. But whenever you're dealing with children, it's just particularly heartbreaking and sad. And for him to be murdered in the way that he was, just essentially beaten to death. And we don't know exactly what the murder weapon was, but we know it was blunt force. And then potentially the stab marks as well involving a knife, and then the corpse dismembered. It's just incredibly sad and tragic. And to think that someone's own father, who's supposed to be there to love and care for them, would do this, it's just particularly heinous when it comes to the different types of crimes that we've seen here.
And on Monday, we had opening statements, and we got a little bit of what the defense might be, right, on Mark Redwine's side. What is his defense?
The defense seems to be that, they're kind of adopting this sort of strained relationship argument and saying that, Dylan just took off, which is really bizarre because this is even though he's a young child, he has a cell phone, he's been texting his friends, and just to think that he would sort of disappear into this really rural part of Colorado and maybe be attacked by animals defies all kind of logic and credibility. But the defense has to come up with something. And, again, as going back to Baby Joe, it seems like, or even Robert Durst, the argument seems to be that there's reasonable doubt here because the murder victim just disappeared and there's some sort of other plausible explanation for the disappearance that isn't foul play and murder.
On the stand, she's a Walmart surveillance video technician going over surveillance video showing Mark Redwine, his son Dylan, in her store, and she's really showing their body language and how strained they appear to be, at least on camera. Let's bring in Neama Rahmani here, former federal prosecutor. Neama, this case really has a lot of details that are disturbing, right?
No question. Many disturbing facts. Obviously, anytime you're dealing with a murder, it's disturbing. But here you have just some terrible facts involving how a young boy was killed. With respect to this particular witness in this video, sometimes what happens is the state wants to introduce a portion of the video. The defense says, no, it's not fair. Rule of completeness. The jury should be entitled to see everything. And that's why we're watching this entire video. But it'll be interesting to see, hopefully after this break, what the meat and potatoes of the state's case is and what they want this jury to see.
Right. I mentioned it not very exciting, but still important, right? Because it sort of establishes evidence of a relationship, a strained relationship between father and son that the prosecutors are saying may have led this father to allegedly kill his son.
No question, and again, we saw the video at the airport. Now we're seeing the video at the Walmart. Apparently, the state thinks that this video is going to be key evidence to show this really bizarre, strained relationship between father and son that led to this murder. And it wasn't a father-son that had a good relationship and a son that just disappeared and was attacked by animals. So apparently state likes this case. They're putting on these witnesses pretty early. They've highlighted it in their opening. So we'll wait to see after the break what comes from this particular witness.
And talk about how Susan Berman told them or gave information that she knew what happened to Robert Durst's first wife. It's hard to get around that, right, if you're, the defense attorney.
And Dick DeGarian and Chip Lewis. Obviously, they got him off on the Morris Black murder out there in Houston. So they've done a good job of cross-examining these witnesses, but Judge Wyndham, more or less everything goes. So we've gotten some very fascinating testimony from folks who are deceased. And, under the hearsay rules, the argument is that Durst is the reason they're deceased, and that's why they're unavailable. But you're hearing really powerful testimony from both Kathy Durst and Susan Berman through their friends as to their role and their relationship with Bob Durst, first and foremost, but most importantly, their fears that if something were to happen to them, that Durst was responsible.
And so the motive here is, peeling back the layers of the case, is that Robert Durst allegedly killed Susan Berman to stop her from talking to investigators about what happened to Durst's first wife, Kathy Durst, back in 1982. But it seems Robert Durst couldn't put the lid on Susan Berman talking to her friends. I mean, because we've got a number of witnesses sort of recalling what Susan Berman told them.
That's certainly John Lewin's theory of the case, that Susan Berman was involved in the cover-up to the Kathy Durst murder. She's the one that placed the infamous phone call to the dean of the medical school, pretending that she was Kathy and calling out sick. And because she knew that Bob had killed his former wife. She was extorting him, demanding payments over years, at least $50,000, and that she threatened to go to law enforcement here in Los Angeles if she didn't continue receiving those payments. And that's why Bob Durst killed her to silence her.
And of course, looming large in this trial is the health of Robert Durst. I mean, he's been in the courtroom almost every day, looking worse and worse. I mean, he's got a number of ailments. He's wearing 2 hearing aids. He looks like he's losing more and more weight, but yet he seems lucid and really engaged in the trial. What do you make of his health?
Fascinating pictures, just the side by side that we have up on the screen. And it's amazing. We started this trial, right before, everything shut down in March of 2020. And, about 15 months, Durst's health, at least just visibly from my perspective and a layperson's perspective, and certainly from the juror's perspective, has deteriorated dramatically just in these past 15 months. And I know it's been the subject of at least 3 or 4 defense motions for mistrial, but there is certainly a difference between mental incapacity and physical incapacity. And, we're dealing with the latter here, his physical health. And, as the judge said, there's certainly case law and precedent to move forward if he can. Now, they're accommodating Durst's medical schedule, but this trial is moving forward, and the judge has made it absolutely clear that there will be justice and a verdict in this case.
Robert Durst nodding off and seemingly deteriorating before our eyes.
That's certainly District Attorney John Lewin's argument, that this is all Hollywood and this is fake. This is part of the defense master plan. He said that in jail calls that Durst has said that he's going to feign dementia and try to get the trial continued or mistrial. With respect to the catheter, famously last week, actually, John Lewin helped Durst change the catheter when it was full. It was just really sort of fascinating after really sort of nastiness between the attorneys and the parties over the course of the past several weeks. So at least from the state's perspective, this is all a ploy by the defense. And really, let's not forget, day 1, Durst refused to even come out of his cell. So day 2 of trial, the judge had to order LA County sheriffs to go in and physically remove him. So part of this may be just some of the credibility that Durst has lost over time by raising some of these issues and the statements that he's made, which really undercut his physical incapacity argument.
And you mentioned the case law surrounding this details the accommodations that would be set out to allow the defendant to be in court for the trial. And part of that accommodation is what we're seeing today. The trial is dark because Robert Durst had a very important medical appointment that he had to be at. And so the trial not in session today. They'll be back tomorrow. So that's evidence there that the judge is at least being accommodating, right?
Yes, Derek, and this isn't the first time. Obviously we're covering this case every single day. And just a couple weeks ago, Durst had a fall. He fell out of his wheelchair while he was in his cell, and the court was dark that day as well. So the court and this particular judge has certainly made accommodations both for Mr. Durst, and for the jurors. And that's why we're looking at at least 5-month trial in this case.
The woman Robert Durst is accused of killing his longtime friend, but his testimony seemed to really kind of contradict itself in terms of what he could recall, and then the statement that Susan Berman told him that Robert Durst killed his first wife, Kathy, but then he thought, well, maybe she was joking or saying that she was actually joking. So let's bring in Neama Rahmani here, former federal prosecutor. And Neama, under what circumstances is a murder a joking matter? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
Derek, you summed it up accurately. They're on this plane ride to New York, Susan Berman and her former boyfriend. And, Susan just drops this bombshell that Robert Durst killed his former wife. And, Paul takes it as, they're talking about murder scripts and mob movies and that type of thing, that maybe she was joking. And, later during his testimony, during cross-examination, Susan Berman, being the daughter of a mob boss, he testifies that, maybe she was killed by mobsters. So, it was, I would say, okay testimony at best for the prosecution, but certainly no smoking gun when the witness himself was so, equivocal about whether, he thought that Susan Berman was joking or not.
Do you think he's telling the truth here, though? This whole line about she was joking, maybe this is sort of a strategy on his part. Do you think that could be the case?
It was interesting. And one of the things that the defense really went after many of the prosecution witnesses were, why are you saying this now, decades later? Why didn't you tell law enforcement, or why didn't you go to the police, in the 80s or 90s? And, about 30, 40 years later, you're finally telling prosecutors and law enforcement officials about all these, supposedly really damaging statements that, Susan Berman and Kathy Durst made to others. So it's very effective, no question, for the defense, because you really don't have those sort of contemporaneous reports that you like as a prosecutor, only these after the fact statements many years later.
But Neama, Paul Kaufman sort of gave an answer to, why bring this forward now during his cross-examination, where he said basically that Susan Berman said crazy things all the time. Take a look.
You never talked directly.
Basically, his testimony that she would say crazy things all the time, confirming he said that to investigators investigating the death of Kathy Durst, the first wife of Robert Durst. So saying crazy things all the time, Neama Rahmani. I mean, this witness seems to fall right into the hands of the defense, really shooting a hole into maybe what, the story is and how Susan Berman was killed and what information she had about what happened to Kathy Durst.
Derek, certainly not helpful evidence for the prosecution, but, again, this is a cold case. This is a challenging case. They got to put forth all the possible evidence that they can, because it's mostly circumstantial. And, what's surprising is not only what Susan Berman, told all her friends, and Kathy Durst did the same, but really their reaction. Apparently of all these witnesses that are coming forward saying, Susan told me that Bob Durst killed his former wife, or, my good friend was involved in the disappearance of his wife, and it was really made national headlines. And you don't have any follow-up by these friends. They sort of listen. There's this one statement that's made in passing, and there's no,
right.
the reaction is really surprising. So I certainly would have reacted differently.
Yeah, interesting point. They almost seem a little nonchalant about it, but it is, some 20 years have gone by, and then this trial has had a big long break due to the pandemic. So maybe that's kind of clouding at least some of their testimony on the stand. But you're right, to your point, they don't seem to be raising any alarm. Certainly they didn't call the police on their friend. That's what comes to my mind when a friend tells you, oh yeah, I have information about a murder. As you said, there's no follow-up.
There really isn't. And, same thing with the abuse, that Kathy Durst allegedly suffered. She's telling her friends that she's been abused. Obviously, it was a different time, but none of them are encouraging her to go forward, get help, talk to law enforcement, social workers, prosecutors, all the things that you would at least nowadays expect if someone said that they were in an abusive relationship. And then fast forward to the murder, you have someone that says they have evidence that their friend was involved in a very high profile public murder that made national headlines. And really there's no reaction, nothing is said. And like you said, Derek, it really plays into the defense's theory of the case that, this is all sort of fabricated, or folks aren't really remembering, or they didn't even believe Susan Berman themselves.
She, well, in his words, that she was overly dramatic. She had dark moods. She seemed very anxious. She even had phobias, one including heights. Let's bring in Neama Rahmani, former federal prosecutor here. Neama, what do you make of this witness?
Testimony was important for the prosecution for two reasons, Derek. The first is they talk about the phobia and the fear, and that Susan Berman would never have opened her home to someone she didn't know. That's part of the state's theory of the case, that Susan Berman must have known her killer because there was no signs of forced entry, there was no evidence of a struggle inside the home, and that she was shot in the back of the head. That plays into John Lewin's argument that it must have been Bob Durst, someone she trusted, that was the murderer. It was also important because he identifies the two $25,000 payments that Susan Berman received, that she was relying on her friends for money. And essentially it was a shakedown of Bob Durst, and extortion that was the motive for him to kill her. Now, the defense did score some points on cross-examination. I don't know if we're going to play that clip, but we can talk about how Markey's testimony also helped the defense as well.
Yeah, and that's really what we're seeing a lot of, these witnesses either helping the defense or siding with Robert Durst, trying to be loyal to him. I mean, we had one friend of Robert Durst, a longtime friend, who basically couldn't remember anything, refused to really give, any rope here at all. There's another witness, though, or actually continuing this Richard Markey. He was cross-examined and really sort of gave some other testimony that you might find conflicting. Take a look.
That was Richard? Yes. So, I'm sure well-bound has been in the coffin and hitched his wagon to her.
Basically not remembering much after previously testifying. He knew and remembered a lot about Susan Berman herself, but not remembering a lot of the details in terms of the questioning he underwent with investigators looking into her murder. Neama Rahmani, former federal prosecutor, does this witness have a lot of value here, at least in this last exchange?
Points here. And really, we're dealing with some of the best attorneys in the country, both in terms of their experience and the fact that they've been living, breathing, working on this case for years, almost a decade. And Chip Lewis did a great job on cross-examination, and he scored 2 big wins against this particular witness, or at least during the cross-examination there. In that, Richard Markey identified 2 other suspects, the first of which was Susan Berman's landlord. And he said that, and this is, we're talking about Richard here, Richard Markey said that Susan Berman was at war with her landlord, and she had a motive to kill her. And then not only the former landlord, the fact that Susan Berman had a very antagonistic relationship with her manager, and this was Brennan. And Markey talked a lot about this really sort of adversarial relationship that they had, and the fact that Brennan may have actually gone into the home after the murder and commented about a fingerprint that he saw in the dust there. So Markey identified 2 additional suspects that may have had motive to kill Susan Berman.
And that plays directly into the defense's hands, for sure. Investigators on the scene of Susan Berman's death talked about really no signs of forced entry, no signs of any physical damage to her home. So let's bring in Neama Rahmani here, former federal prosecutor. Neama, we've heard from other witnesses that Susan Berman had real fears and phobias about, answering the door, letting people in to her home. And yet we've got this detective testifying that there was no forced entry. How does that square?
Important for the state's case, and even though this is not your typical murder case, as a prosecutor, you always want to address motive, means, and opportunity, right? So the motive in this case, who would want Susan Berman killed? Bob Durst, just to silence her.
It's kind of a rundown house.
To the extent that there's no forced entry, there's no signs of a struggle. Not a dollar was stolen from Susan Berman's house, or a credit card or wallet was there, open in plain sight. She's shot in the back of the head, execution style. So Lewin has argued very well that Susan Berman must have known her murderer, must have let him or her in voluntarily, and this was not a case where someone's trying to rob her or to break into the house. This is someone she trusted and someone she knew, and that's why it must have been Bob Durst.
But even if that were the case, though, the defense would argue it doesn't necessarily have to be Bob Durst. It could be someone else, right? Letting someone in, maybe someone she knew. It's been shown that she had a lot of friends and a lot of acquaintances and people who may have reason to kill her, people that she had definite conflicts with.
That's why the state really tried to focus on that phobia and the fact that she was so security conscious. She would not have just opened the door to anyone. This isn't someone that would welcome strangers into her home. So it must have been someone she knew, must have been someone she trusted. Now, could it have been her manager? Could it have been her landlord? Absolutely, at least according to the defense. But it certainly would not have been a stranger. They would have no reason to want to kill her. And there was no reason that Susan would have allowed that person into her home because of her phobias.
Parts of the investigation. Neama Rahmani, what did you make of this? In terms of, him not wearing any protective gear when he went into the scene.
Derek, this is a tried and true defense strategy, that the best defense is a good offense. go after law enforcement, particularly LAPD, which unfortunately is notorious for botching some of these murder investigations, going back to OJ, for doing a sloppy investigation. So that's what the defense did here, and they did a pretty effective job, like they always do. It's already a very strong defense case, but this certainly helped to say that LAPD did not do a job collecting all the potential evidence, looking in the hill behind Susan Berman's home for other suspects or other evidence, and they really just kind of jumped to conclusions here that Bob Durst was involved, but really there's no physical evidence connecting him there too.
But had the evidence been collected properly, Neama, would we know definitively who killed Susan Berman? Would it have pointed directly to Robert Durst, or would we just not know? Either way, would we be still at the point we are today?
I don't think we would, because the state's theory of the case is that Susan Berman allowed Bob into her home because she knew him. There was this dog feces that both parties were talking about in terms of the attorneys. When Susan Berman bent over to clean it up with a paper towel, that's when Durst shot her in the back of the head. So this was something that was unexpected, and there really would be no physical evidence left behind, even according to the state's theory of the case.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, the court was dark today because Robert Durst had some medical testing to undergo. We're assuming he'll be back tomorrow in the same condition he was when we last saw him last week, which is not good, right? I mean, we're seeing a deterioration of Robert Durst really before our eyes.
Derek, and this is something that the state has to be concerned about, sympathy. You know, this isn't the same person who 40 years ago allegedly killed his former wife, or even 20 years ago killed his best friend. This is someone who is old, who is frail, who jurors may question, is he capable of carrying out not just one, but 3 murders? And because we're still talking about Morris Black here, even though he was acquitted on the most serious charges. So this is certainly something that John Lewin and the district attorney's office has to be concerned about. Is the jury going to believe that Bob Durst is physically capable of murder?
Right, and the judge was made it clear that he's going to continue this trial no matter what, even as the defense argued or tried to argue that the case should be suspended because of Durst's health. We, of course, are covering the trial. Thank you so much, Neama Rahmani. More of our coverage of California versus Robert Durst here on Law and Crime. I'm Derek Dennis.